Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're going to be building a small cabinet. Now this project was very interesting. Now unlike a lot of my recent projects, this one did not go very well. So rather than making a video talking about how I built it, in this video we're really going to be focusing on what I would do differently if I was going to do this project again. Now, one thing I want to make very clear here is that I actually really like how this project came out. Even though it went very poorly overall, the final product is still pretty nice, and I am quite happy with it. Overall, this was just a great learning opportunity of a project, and like I said before, it didn't go very well, but I did learn a lot from doing it. So right off the bat, the main problem that I had with this project was my initial planning. I didn't do enough quality planning before I actually jumped into this project. I didn't really have a good idea of what I wanted to do and how I best wanted to approach this project. And what I mean by that is normally with my projects, I try to take a very balanced approach between the machinery, the hand tools, all that kind of stuff, and I try to use the best qualities of both. But for this project, I fell back on being a little bit lazy and trying to really use the machinery. Now the reason this is a problem is rather than designing the best piece of furniture I could, I manipulated the design and tried to make things easier to work around the machinery in that. So I definitely did not allow myself the freedom to make the piece as cool as I normally would like to, and I kind of ignored a lot of the stuff I've learned over the past few years. Surprisingly enough, this is actually a very similar way to the way that I built the bedroom set, and like I said in that series, I actually really liked the way that they came out too, but I had a whole lot of trouble, building it throughout the whole project. So the fact that I kind of fell back onto that mindset on this project, I do find it kind of funny, and this was just a good reminder of, rather than focusing on how I'm going to make it, just design the best piece of furniture possible, and then go at it with whatever method I find works best in the shop. With all of our pieces milled up, we can now move on to our joinery. Now, there's nothing really that went wrong here, and there's nothing really special about it. I just went with my standard mortise and tenon joinery, but this is an area where I did actually get to do a little bit of experimentation. So first off, just mortise and tenon joinery is the easiest method I have in the shop for creating structure. You can always use domino joinery, dowel joinery, whatever, to replace mortise and tenon joinery. It's all basically the same thing. I just really like this method. Now, one of the things that I did get to try out with the mortiser is I got a comment saying to just take small cuts with the mortise chisel. So you plunge in a little bit, then you pull up the chisel all the way out, then you plunge back in again. And this was a really good method to actually use this mortiser because it made sure that the bit did not get too hot, and it really saved the effort on my shoulder. I also made sure to take the time to tune up all the joinery with my block plane. Now these are only 1/4 inch wide tenons, so you can see I'm rocking around a little bit with that with my block plane, but overall the process worked a lot better and gave me nice, good fitting joinery. And if you look at the top and bottom structure on the side structure here, you'll notice that they're quite a bit thicker. I don't want to talk about them too much right now because we're going to be working on them a little bit more later on, but just keep that in mind because that was a cool part of the experimentation on this project. From there, the last bit of structural joinery was a half lap dovetail for the top front rail. Now this again is one of the best joints for making a top front rail because it's very strong and helps hold the whole piece together so that it can't actually fall apart. Again, at this point, we're not really to the area where we're really running into any issues. This was a really fun part of the project when you're just kind of getting the structure of the piece together. It's just kind of on autopilot at this point in time. I'm not really thinking too much about what I'm doing. I don't really need to think too much about what I'm doing because I'm just following the plans and just building the structure, and this is the easiest part. It's when you get past the structure, that's where you got to start paying attention more to what you're doing. Now, that's not to say that right here I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. Obviously, I'm putting a lot of focus onto cutting these dovetails as cleanly as I can, but it's also, at this point in the project, I can make pretty much any mistake possible, and there's still plenty of stuff I can do to fix it. So this is just about the best part of any project for me, is when we're just building out the structure of whatever it is, because you always have that freedom to go through and change things to fix things. Later on, as you progress through the project, you really got to start paying more attention, being very careful and very decisive with what you're doing, because your opportunities to make fixes become much more limited. Now, one of the things that I kind of wish I did differently on this project, just because it turned into a very experimental one, is that I tried some different types of joinery. Now, the problem that I run into is I have gotten decently good at dovetails as well as mortise and tenon joinery, so I kind of fall back on them as my default. Now, those are two of your most common joints for pretty much any project, but there's ways that you can make them more interesting by doing, through variants with mortise and tenon or doing different shape dovetails, stuff like that. But for the most part, I stick to the very generic stuff. So going forward in projects, I'm definitely going to be pushing myself to get a little bit more creative with my joinery and trying to get outside of this little bubble that I've gotten myself stuck in. So I'm still going to be using primarily dovetails and mortise and tenon joinery for my structural stuff, but hopefully I can make it a little bit more interesting in the future. With the primary structure together, we can now focus on putting together the side structure. So all I'm going through and doing here is adding a groove to all of my side structure pieces, as well as the center divider pieces that we're going to be adding in. You can also see here, these are the top and bottom structures that I was talking about before for the side structure. And the reason I left them thicker is because I wanted to experiment this idea of using a thicker piece and then adding in a bevel to create a really nice transition. And this is a technique that I am definitely going to be adding to a whole bunch of my projects going forward here, because I think it just blends everything a little bit better. Now, the one issue that I did create with these pieces is I did flush them up with the legs, and I didn't really like the look of that, but having that thick bevel on there, I think, really made a very interesting look in the final piece. From there, we can move on to cutting all of our structural pieces again. This is just a matter of fitting these pieces up. Now, this is an area where I did run into a bit of an issue because, again, I fell back on the mindset of being a little bit lazy. You can see here I'm just kind of gluing up all of my pieces, and rather than having them tied into actual mortise and tenons, they're just sitting in a groove. Now, this is not the greatest way to do it because things don't exactly sit where you want them to sit all the time. It's a little bit harder to set up. Again, I made it work here. You can see that those little pieces jammed into the groove there kind of held everything in place during the glue up. But overall, again, it was not the best practice. So the most important experiment in this whole project was using the combination of some stained wood and some natural wood. And so the only way that you can actually make that work, unless you're really skilled with your staining abilities, is to make sure that you can add in your floating panels in that after all your finishing has been done. So the way I'm going to be doing that on this project is by cutting these rabbets on the inside of these frames here. I can then add in those floating panels after everything has been completed, and that's exactly the same way you do glass or something later on. This will allow me to stain the outside frame while leaving those panels just natural cherry. With the side structures completed, we can now move on to our cross structure, which is what I like to call the area between the two side structures, because this is just made up of a whole bunch of long pieces going between those two already assembled side structures. For the bottom structures, I'm using the same kind of gentle curve that I've started to use on a lot of my projects. I find that this just elevates the piece a little bit more, just adds in a little bit of a subtle touch so that your piece is not just, you're not just using square pieces all over. And it's very easy to add in. Of course, I'm using a bit of a fancy compass plane here, but you can do this with a spoke shave, a sander, really any method works. And just adding in that gentle curve is a touch that I really have just kind of started to rely on in a lot of my projects, because I really think that it just makes that bottom stretcher look a little bit better. Now, again, this is another area where I would like to get a little bit creative someday and try and figure out something that's a little bit better to do, but not too Victorian era woodworking, with all that too much detail. But yeah, the subtle curve is just a nice, simple touch. Once I'd completed the glue up, this is where I ran into my first major issue with the project, and that was how the heck do I clean this whole thing up? Because now, even though this is a fairly small cabinet, it's still a decently large structure to put up on the workbench and kind of maneuver myself around and the tools around in order to get all of these surfaces nicely cleaned up. The other part of this is because I had a lot of flush perpendicular joinery, trying to use the hand plane on it was just resulting in tear out in one area and damage to the other areas, so it was very hard to get a nice clean finish. Now, funny enough, the solution to this is something that I've done on so many of my projects, and that is using what I call the step design, where you basically step each piece just an 1/8 of an inch or a 1/16 of an inch below the previous level, and this just allows you to get all your pieces nicely cleaned up before you ever even do the glue up. So I don't know why I didn't think about that on this project specifically. Again, I think I was thinking just too much about using the machinery, doing all that kind of stuff. But it's one of those things that, again, going forward, that step design is going to be the thing that I use in pretty much every project, because of the fact that I can get all my pieces just perfectly cleaned up before I ever introduce glue. Because once you glue everything up, it becomes very challenging to actually work on. Now, the method I'm using for this project might actually work for some people, because you can get everything together, then you can work on your finishing and all that kind of all at once. But for me, I find it very challenging to keep track of the areas that I've actually finished. So because I'm kind of going through the combination of using my hand planes first, then I need to go make sure I go through and sand everything so that the staining later on looks good, I have to make sure that I go through and remove all the tear out, but also going through and sanding later on. So what ended up happening in a lot of areas on this project is I either just forgot to hand plane it to take out that tear out, or I forgot to go back and sand it, which meant I got a little bit of a messier staining job later on. So overall, for me, when I'm working with a whole bunch of small pieces, it's very easy to do a good job of the finishing work. When I have a solid structure like this, that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. For anyone wondering, this tool is called a Yankee screwdriver, and you're going to be seeing it a lot more throughout this project because it is a tool that I absolutely love to use. At this point in the project, this is where I kind of decided that this was going to be a good opportunity for me to experiment with stuff, because what had happened is I got too focused on making YouTube videos and I didn't focus on the woodworking enough. So because I knew I wasn't going to be able to get this project done in a proper time frame in order to get a video out, I decided to start another project, which is the toolbox that you guys may have already seen. I highly recommend you go check out that video after this one if you haven't seen it already. But I set this project aside and then came back to it about 3 weeks later, and that's where I ran into the issue of having to try and figure things out again. So when I say that this is one I decided was going to be experimental, this is about as experimental as I can get. So what we're doing here is making our drawer box components, but all this material came from normal 2x6 dimensional lumber. Now you'll see all over YouTube, all these videos with these clickbaity titles, can you use dimensional lumber in fine woodworking? And the simple and obvious answer is yes. The thing you have to understand about it is that it's not always going to be the best quality wood. This stuff had tons of small knots in it. There's even a lot of spots where the knots fell out, so you just end up with holes. But I wanted to see for myself whether or not this would actually look good in the finished product or it would look really bad. And so I'm actually really happy to say that it looks good, and this is definitely a technique that I would use again in the future. Because the biggest benefit here is just the cost of materials. Pine, and especially construction grade pine, is very inexpensive, and as long as you make sure that it's dry and you try to watch the pieces that you're picking so you don't end up with too many knots, it works great, and it lets you save a little bit of money on an area of a project that is not going to be seen too intensely. And even if it is, these drawer boxes are still made with pretty beautiful hand-cut dovetails, and overall I don't think they take away from the quality of the piece, even though they're made from pine, even though they have some of those holes in them. I was able to incorporate the look of that pine just into the project as a whole. So again, I highly recommend, if you want to save a buck on your project, you want to build it out of a beautiful hardwood on the outside, go right ahead. But if you want to save just a little bit of money on that project, try making your drawer boxes out of some simple construction grade lumber, and just make sure you take the steps to make sure that it's dry and just ready to work with. That's the biggest thing you got to watch out for with that construction grade lumber. Now, the one limitation I would put on pine for drawers is that you don't want to make your drawers too big or use it in drawers that are going to be opened often, like on a dresser. Now, it works on this project because this is just a small cabinet that's going to sit in the side of my office, and I'm going to open these drawers, maybe once a day, which is not very much. Because the one thing you have to watch out for with pine is because it's so soft, screws have a very easy time kind of moving around and eating away at the material around them. So your pine drawer boxes are going to wear out a lot faster compared to a hardwood drawer box, but again, you have to remember that a drawer box is actually really easy to replace. If in 30 years the drawer boxes on this piece are worn out and I want to pass it off to someone else, I can slap together some new hardwood drawer boxes and this thing will be good to go. Yes, it's a little bit of work, but for now I get to save a little bit of money on a project, which, you got to take it where you can get it every once in a while, and this is a pretty good compromise for something that is still going to be fully functional for plenty of time. The other nice thing about using pine for the drawer boxes is they were super easy to fit up. Hand planing the pine, other than when you would catch the occasional knot, is just super easy. It's so much easier than hardwood for some reason. Even with a sharp iron, hardwood, sometimes there's still some struggle to get through it. But the pine just came off in these beautiful thin shavings, just, so much fun to work with. But then from there, all we had to do is just go through and mount the drawer boxes into the drawer slides. Again, Yankee screwdriver coming into play. I love that thing. Then, yeah, it's just a matter of getting the drawer slides mounted up. Moving on to the drawer fronts, what I'm doing here is taking a piece of 6/4 cherry and book matching it, which is going to basically give me two 5/8 thick drawer fronts. Now, a question I get all the time is how do you decide what style of drawer you want to make? Because there's basically two different styles that I use. There's this style where I'm using 3 separate pieces, so mechanical drawer slides, a drawer front, and then a drawer box. Or there's the other style where you just build a single solid wood drawer box. Now, the look of the solid wood drawer box, I always prefer that method. The trick is that it's not as functional, in my opinion, as using mechanical drawer slides, because mechanical drawer slides, it doesn't really matter how much weight you pack into these drawers, it's always going to open and close nice and smooth. Whereas when I compare that to like the drawers that I built into my desk, or the pie cupboard, or the dresser I built for my sister, all of those pieces of furniture, the drawers can be a little bit heavy to open. They take a little decent amount of force, just depending on what you have sitting in them. So my rule of thumb right now is if a drawer is over 10 inches wide or 6 inches tall, then I'll always use mechanical drawer slides, just because, again, for me, I think that it's just a little bit easier to open the drawer. Now, I plan to break this rule on probably my next project, just to, again, experiment and learn, but it's all about figuring out what works best for you and just playing around, figuring out what you prefer. Some people prefer the kind of the solid nature of a fully, just a solid drawer box. Other people prefer the ease of opening with mechanical drawer slides and that. So again, I highly recommend you mess around with it, try both methods. I don't know if there's a third method that you could probably try, but if you get creative, you might be able to find one. And look at this, we've got more pine from Home Depot. So this is where, again, experimentation is an interesting thing. So what I wanted to do for these shelves in the bottom panel of the cabinet area was use a solid piece of wood. Now in my shop, I didn't have any pieces of wood that would have been wide enough, and I would have had to do a glue up. So then the idea came to me that, hey, I could just pop down to Home Depot and just buy a 12-inch wide piece of select pine, which theoretically has less knots in it, which, the piece that I got was pretty good. Overall, I had to dig through the pile for a little while to find one that was as nice as the one that I got, but it did work out in the end. And I'll be honest, I know exactly what is going to happen to these shelves. Over time, they're going to get beat up. If I put a book down too hard on them, if I'm picking up a candle or something in the cabinet and I accidentally drop it, these shelves are going to get dented and dinged up over time. But the nice thing about pine is that it's meant to get beat up. It really is meant to show the history of the piece. Every little dent, every little nick in the wood is really just a part of the history of whatever the heck it is. So that is one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons that I want to try and use pine more in the future is just for that history aspect. You can find beautiful oak or cherry tables that are just pristine, 100 years old, and they're absolutely pristine, whereas you'd never find a piece of pine furniture that is in any kind of good condition if it's an antique. So it's one of the things that I like about pine, I like about the idea of pine, is that it does show the history of the piece a little bit better than a lot of hardwoods will. So at this point, you're probably wondering why I'm going through all the effort of adding in these breadboard ends, and the whole trick here is that it's just meant to keep these panels flat. Breadboard ends are something that are so easy to add into a panel like this that I don't know why I don't see people do it all the time. For just a little bit of extra work, it means that these shelf panels and the base panel are going to stay perfectly flat basically forever. So it's definitely one of those things I always recommend doing. If you have a wide piece of wood or just a panel anywhere and you want to make sure it stays nice and flat, throw on some breadboard ends. It's a very classy touch because it just adds in some extra joinery and just some visual interest, and it's really not hard to do. So lately I've been pushing myself to work with the lumber that I have in my shop. And as you can see behind me, that lumber pile is fairly full. There's a lot of stuff there, or at least it looks like there's a lot of stuff there. But the problem that I've kind of constantly run into while trying to do this is that I have a lot of different types of wood and a lot of different pieces in that, but it's very hard to find stuff that actually goes together and still looks good, because that's a very important part of the whole fine woodworking thing to me. Is it's all about considering the grain, the colors of the wood, how every piece looks when they come together, and that is it's really important to take the time to consider that before you just start slapping pieces of wood together. So the pieces for the doors all came from one of my last full boards of 6/4 cherry. And again, the reason for this is because I want the wood that goes into the doors to look fairly consistent with each other, because they are right on the front of the project and they're going to be very obvious. If I had a whole bunch of just different colored grain and all that kind of stuff put together, it would be very noticeable and wouldn't look very good. So the reason I used a 6/4 board rather than some of the 4/4 pieces that I had left sitting around is because I wanted these pieces to be 1 inch wide and have good straight, almost quarter sawn grain, quarter or rift sawn grain. So by taking that 6/4 board and cutting strips off of it, I was able to get perfectly sized pieces that all had nice straight grain structure to them. And that worked really well to make these doors look nice and consistent with each other. All of these pieces blended together really nicely, and I did have the benefit of having that really good straight grain look to them. Now, the doors were one of the biggest problems that I had with this project in its final form, because what ended up happening is that the doors picked up a pretty good twist, and I actually know exactly where it came from. During the glue up here, everything was on a nice flat workbench. I'd made sure to check that. And when I took this door out of the clamps, it was actually nice and flat, but passing it through my drum sander is actually where I introduced a whole bunch of twist. Now the problem is that I did not try hard enough to get that twist out, and it ended up becoming a little bit worse by the time I finally got the doors installed on this project. So you'll see in some of the final clips that there is still some twist present in the doors. Now I can fully admit that I was being a little bit lazy here. Very early on, right after I finished doing the sanding on the doors, I realized that there was a little bit of twist to them, and right then and there, I should have taken the time to try and get the twist out. I should have done everything I possibly could to flatten off the doors. That would have been the proper thing to do, but I just kind of kept working on them, hoping that magically that twist would disappear, and lo and behold, it did not. So again, this is a very good just learning opportunity for me. As soon as I see that twist starting to appear in the doors, I need to do something about it, because it's not just going to magically go away. And it's one of those things that I don't know why I made that choice in this project. I don't know why I made such a simple error, but it's one of those things that now that I've made that error, it's going to stick with me forever. Now, in my defense though, one of the things I did want to try out here is because I was adding in these panels, the floating panels, afterwards, I wanted to see what would happen if I took those perfectly flat floating panels and attached them in, to see if that would take the twist out of the door, that kind of thing. And surprisingly enough, it did remove it a little bit. Just by adding the rigidity of those panels tacked in place, as you're going to see later on here, it did bring some form back to the doors and made them a little bit more solid and took out just a little bit of that twist. Not enough to fully solve the issue, but it definitely made a bit of a difference. So it's one of those things, if there's a little bit of twist, then you might be able to fudge it. But overall, if the doors were as twisted as they were here, I definitely should have done a better job with it. Now, because of that twist, I wanted to find a fairly aggressive method for holding these doors shut, because I thought that if I just overwhelmed that twist with force, I might be able to still pull those doors in nice and flat. So this is where I came up with this idea of making these magnetic catches. So this is just some super cheap steel from Home Depot. It's mild steel, and I'm just using my little 1x30 here to put a little bit of a curvature to the edge of it so that you don't end up cutting your hand on it. So I'm going to be adding in 2 of these plates, one to the top, one to the bottom, and that way when I put the magnets to the door, they have a lot of surface area to grab onto, so they should have a very strong connection. Now again, in my testing here, they did have a very strong connection, and before I put in the floating panels, it was enough to take out the twist. But once I added in some of that rigidity of the floating panels, it ended up not working out so well, which is why we have a little bit visible in the end product. But again, it's one of those things where it was a really interesting thing to try, and especially these two metal tabs. This is something I'm going to be adding to a lot more projects because I think it looks really good and it works great. So on to the floating panels now. This is where I'm going to splurge a little bit again and use some of my thicker, bigger pieces of cherry just to make sure I can get these pieces to be as similar to each other as possible. So we're going to be using one of my favorite techniques of taking a thick piece of wood like this is 8/4 stock, and just taking strips off the side in order to make up the panels. Now this works out really well because I can dial in my thickness so that I have the minimal amount of waste. Because my final panel thickness is about a 1/2 inch, I could take these just over that, and there was plenty of thickness for milling and all that, and it just meant that I could make the most use out of the material that I had. Then I can go through and just lay out the grains so that they all kind of flow and work together. So the idea here is you're just trying to make sure that your pieces don't have anything in the grain that's going to, not look good beside other pieces. Now, this is a very challenging thing to do because until you put finish on that wood, you can't really see all the characteristics of it. So on some of these panels, there are pieces that are a little bit darker, that are stuck beside pieces that are a little bit lighter, and they don't blend very well. But over time, just with the way that cherry is, as it darkens, those pieces will kind of blend together a lot better. To fit these panels, I'm using the Shaker raised panel bit from Lee Valley. Now what this does is it adds in a flat section as well as a 22-degree angle on the bevel there, and you'll get to see that in just a second when I flip the panel over. But what I found here is that the router table that I have is not the greatest. It doesn't have a perfectly flat surface, and the router bit did leave a little bit of burning. But I could go back in and using my rabbiting block plane, with the fence and the handy depth stop that it comes with, I was able to just go in and tune them up and clean them up and make them look really good. Now, one of the weirdest decisions I made in this project was to round the corner of these panels. The proper thing to do would have been to go in and square up the corners of the rabbets where these panels are going to fit in later on. I don't know why I chose to do this, but it definitely came back to bite me in the butt later on, and you guys get to see how that works. But yeah, this was a weird choice, and I don't quite know why I chose to do it. Then comes the tabletop. Now, the tabletop is the one part of this project that I can safely say is awesome. I love the tabletop of this. I got a little bit experimental with it and not super crazy. I already used this kind of slat structure design on the entryway table, but for me on this one, I had to figure out a way to work with a whole bunch of small pieces of cherry that also had a ton of sapwood to them. So the big problem with cherry, in my opinion, is that the sapwood is just disgusting looking. It's this kind of creamy green color. Overall, it does not look good. So it is unlike walnut or white oak. I refuse to let cherry sapwood be visible anywhere on a project. But on something like a tabletop here, there's a lot of areas to go in and hide some of that cherry sapwood. So a lot of these pieces I'm using here for this tabletop are actually pieces that would have probably ended up in the scrap bin, but I was able to kind of cut them up and shape them in a way that hid a lot of that sapwood on the underside. And I did end up having to change up my plans a little bit, mainly that the long bars on the front, I couldn't get those long pieces out of a perfectly clear piece of cherry. So just in order to hide that sapwood that was going to end up in them anyway, I just stuck them between the two end caps, and this will make more sense when you guys see the whole tabletop come together here. But this allowed me to hide that end grain of those long pieces behind some solid cherry, and those smaller end pieces were very easy to get out of good, clean, solid cherry. So again, overall, it's just a matter of figuring out what you have and manipulating it a little bit to make it work for what you need. Now, this is one of the things I really like about what I'm trying to do at the moment, where I'm trying to prevent myself from going to a lumberyard and buying new wood. I'm trying to work with just the stuff that I have in my shop. And so I find that this forces me to think a little bit more creatively and find different solutions that I might not otherwise have thought of. Now, this does make the project just a little bit more challenging, but it does help you find those designs that are very unique and very interesting. The single best touch I added to this tabletop was going in and beveling all of the top edges of every single piece on here. What this did is it created great separation between each of the pieces. So in the tabletop, it's one solid form. You can feel that it's solid and one solid mass, but each piece stands out on its own and kind of has those highlights and details that makes it its own individual piece, making up that larger panel. And now we finally get to apply stains. What I'm using here is the tried and true Java stain, which is a really nice all-natural stain. But this is where things really took a turn for the worst, and I got to see just how bad of a job I did on my finishing work on this project. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, this was a very hard project to finish because I glued everything up and then had to do all my finishing work. And this made it very hard to keep track of the areas where I'd done a good finishing job and which areas I hadn't gotten to yet. So when I applied stain, this really went through and highlighted the areas that I did not finish properly. You know, there were still streaks from the sander or just nicks from the hand plane, stuff that I should have easily been able to get out. And the problem is, as soon as you apply oil to the wood, it then becomes nearly impossible to sand, because when you try to sand it, it clogs the sandpaper. So I decided to leave all those imperfections in the final piece, which you'll see in the glory shots here in a little bit. I left them in there just as a good lesson for me, because this piece is just going to sit in my office and I can look at it as a stark reminder for what I need to pay attention to on every single project. Now again, like I said before, I don't know why I decided to round over the panels, because when I went to try and add in the nailer strips that are actually going to hold these panels in place, I found that trying to create that curvature in the corners was nearly impossible. So on the doors, I went in and squared them up, and this did leave a little bit of a nastiness in the corners, which again, I left it in the final piece as a good reminder for what not to do. But overall, I have to say that I really like this method of building. And even though this project overall did not come out being what I had expected or as good as I'd wanted it to be, it was a really good opportunity to kind of go in and iron out the kinks in this method of building. You know, figuring out that what these panels do to the doors, how best to add them in with all that, you know, all that kind of stuff. It was really great to have kind of a trial run on a piece of furniture with this method of building. So as we start to do the final assembly here, I want to thank you guys for making this far into the video, and the glory shots are coming up in just a minute here. But one thing I want to mention about those glory shots is what I tried to do differently in this video compared to a lot of my other ones is I made sure to show some of the mistakes that I made and some of the key areas where I screwed up. So as you're watching through there's going to be a combination of areas of this piece that I really like and other areas that I really hate. And it's all about appreciating this piece of furniture for what it is. There's a lot of areas that I can't go back and change just because the piece is done. There's no point going back in and trying to fix mistakes with how good of a lesson this piece of furniture gave me. This whole project in general was just a very good learning opportunity, and it was really interesting for me personally, but I hope you guys got something out of it too. So as always guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.